Good morning, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. Can we create sustainable, resilient and healthy communities, or do they just happen? My name's Claire Walter. I'm a member of the Climate College, and I'd like to start today in acknowledging the traditional owners of the various lands from which we're joining this webinar, and in paying my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. And in addition, I'd also like to acknowledge the tangata whenua of Aotearoa, New Zealand, where we have Professor Simon Kingham presenting today from. The webinar is being recorded today and the video will be available on the college website by tomorrow. Please submit any questions that you may have for Simon at any time, and we'll get to as many of them as we can at the end during the Q&A session after the presentation. To submit a question, and also you can upvote other people's questions, please use the Q&A feature, which you'll see at the bottom of your screen. You're also invited to use the chat feature, but please don't post specific questions for the Q&A session there, as we'll only be monitoring the Q&A channel. And if we run out of time, the upvote function is quite useful because it prioritises the questions for Simon at the end. All right, I'd like to now present Professor Simon Kingham. He's a Professor of Geography at the University of Canterbury, where he also directs the GeoHealth Laboratory. In February 2018, he became the Ministry of Transport's first and only Chief Science Advisor, to which he's seconded 2 days a week. This is for New Zealand, obviously, we're talking about. He's researched widely in areas related to the environment, health and wellbeing. The first 15 years saw a strong focus on air pollution exposure and health, but more recently, the focus has become the urban built environment and wellbeing. I'll hand you over to Simon.
Cool. Thank you very much. I'm just going to share my screen. Right, so hopefully you can see my screen there. I'm just going to start with what we call a mihi, which is a welcome in New Zealand in Māori. So tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. Ko kohakura te moanga, ko opawaho te awa, no ingarangi aho, ko ototahi toku kainga inaine. Ko Simon Kingham aho, ko te whare wananga o Waitaha me te manatu, waka oku wahi mahi tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. And that's a traditional way of introducing yourselves in New Zealand. And what I told you is that my river is the Heathcote River in Christchurch, just down the road from me. And my mountain is the Port Hills. And normally they would be, the river and the mountain would be from where I grew up. But I grew up in a very uninteresting, boring part of England, just north of London, where we had no discernible river or no discernible mountain. So I now have the ones I live near. I then said I come from the UK, so I was born in England and I now work at the University of Canterbury in the Ministry of Transport. And today I'm going to talk a little bit about, can we create sustainable, resilient and healthy communities, or do they just happen? So how random is it? Just a little bit of context. As has just been said, I work 2 days a week for the Ministry of Transport, so I'm seconded. And this is actually what my job description says. It is to provide advice to the ministry on areas that would benefit from scientific input and champion the ministry's use of evidence through the policy process and its development of wider sector strategies. In essence, what my job is to do is to ensure that any policy advice that goes to ministers is evidence-based. It doesn't mean that ministers necessarily have to use it. It doesn't mean that all policy that ministers push through is evidence-based, but it is to ensure that what is sent up from the ministry is evidence-based. As I say, it doesn't mean I see all the evidence that's submitted, but that's the job. I get the opportunity, so I work with ministry officials, and I also meet ministers regularly. The minister, or we actually had 3 ministers of transport. I don't know how many we'll have now because we have a new government which will be put in place in the next week or so, and it's going to look slightly different, so we don't know who we'll have, but that's my job there. And the other 3 days a week, I'm a professor at the University of Canterbury, I said. And I teach and research on things related to broadly urban issues, but particularly with a focus on health. Just a bit about the context. I'm going to talk today about urban community and how we create resilient communities, or can we encourage or foster or plan them. And I will talk about some research projects. I'll just mention them. So some come through the GeoHealth Laboratory, which I direct. It's now been going 13 years. It's funded by the Ministry of Health, at the nexus of geospatial science and health. And so we do research for them. We've been going 13 years. Our contract goes till next June, at which point we've been told it will not continue. We all love our Director General of Health, but he is the person who made that decision. But he made it in very good reason. He actually said, we need more of this capability in the ministry. So he is now going to be appointing people to do what we've done for the last 13 years. So in a way, I think we might argue that we've done such a good job that the ministry feel that they now need to take it on in a more permanent way. So we take that as a compliment. There's a project called Resilient Urban Futures that was part of the New Zealand Centre for Sustainable Cities, which is a cross-university initiative in this country. Another project that comes out of one of the national science challenges. So the government in this country said, what are the big science challenges? And then they funded 11 of them to do research. So I was involved in one called Building Better Homes, Towns and Cities, and another one called Healthier Lives. So there's some research that I'm going to show you that'll come out of them. Another project called Well Connected, funded by the Ministry of Health through the Health Research Council and Healthier Lives. And I'll tell you a little bit about that project when we come to it. A little touch on one called Happins. It's a health and air pollution in New Zealand project. And then obviously some work I've been doing through the Ministry of Transport. So there's some of the things I'll draw on as we go through this. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start by saying, addressing the question, what is a sustainable, resilient, healthy community? So what actually is a community that look like? Like, what are the outcomes we're seeking to achieve if we want a sustainable, resilient, and healthy community? How do we get there? So we'll then look at the question, how do we get there, or do they just happen? What are the outcomes if we achieve communities that we are arguing are sustainable, resilient, and healthy? What are the outcomes of that? So what outcomes do we see amongst people and other metrics as well? And then have a little think at the end about the future. So what are some of the future technologies that we're now looking at that are coming on stream? And what might they do for communities? And what are some of the things we might need to think about in terms of risks potentially of those and also opportunities? So start with the question, what is a sustainable, resilient, and healthy community? And I think there's a few things. So first of all, I think we'd say it is a community that has low emissions, that reduces emissions. And one example would be greenhouse gas emissions, but another one would be air pollutants. So I think we'd argue a sustainable, resilient, healthy community has low emissions. Secondly, that it's resilient to shocks and pressures. So it's resilient to disasters. So it's resilient in the context of Christchurch and New Zealand more broadly. We're very interested in making our communities as resilient as possible to earthquakes, but also tsunamis. And of course, more recently, we're now talking obviously pandemics. So what can we learn from what's happening at the moment to make our communities respond better next time it happens? Because I think we can all pretty much say there will be a next time, sadly. There's a lot of work. The Ministry of Transport's been doing some work looking at some of the behavior changes that happened to say, how can we lock some of those behavior changes in? So how can we say, look, some of these behavior changes have been good. What can we do to make those long lasting? So the sort of example they're looking at is things like, how can you encourage people to work from home a bit more? Because we know if they work from home, you reduce traffic congestion, etc. And the second lot of resilient shocks and pressures are things like climate change. So how do we make our communities, and it's linked to the first point, more resilient to some of the things that are coming with climate change? The next group is that we have healthy and happy people. So we can look particularly at things like physical health. So can we design, is a sustainable, resilient, healthy community one where obesity rates are lower, heart disease is reduced, respiratory disease is reduced, but also, I guess, mental health as well, that sometimes we forget about mental health. I think increasingly, certainly in New Zealand, it's going up in the list of priorities. But can we actually design communities that enhance mental well-being, and what does that look like? And finally, and this one's got a question mark because some people might argue it's less overt, but can we actually have a community that is equitable? And within that, so in other words, can you reduce the gap between rich and poor? Can you enhance the well-being of people on low incomes, etc.? But that might also include meeting Indigenous obligations. Now, in New Zealand, we talk about the Treaty of Waitangi, which is the treaty that established New Zealand and the relationship between Māori and Europeans. And so in New Zealand, that is enshrined in doctrine in the Treaty of Waitangi that says we actually have to do some of this stuff and make it meaningful. So can we make it equitable, particularly in that sort of context as well? So how do we get there? Is it planned or random? What are some of the features of these sorts of communities, and how can we enhance them into the future? Is it planned, random? Is it accident or design? So a few things from some of the projects we found is, and this comes out of a project we did in Christchurch after the earthquakes, that urban form is really important. And when communities that do better are often communities that have well-defined or understood boundaries. So they're communities where everybody knows where they are. And there's research that shows in some communities, you ask people where they are and they're not quite sure. You ask them to draw the boundary of a community and they're not quite sure where it is. And so there's some sort of clarity of spatial area. So the community I live in is in the loop of a river. So everybody knows where that community starts and ends. There's other communities which are through the tunnel. We have a community, we have a tunnel that goes through near Christchurch. And when you go through the tunnel, everyone knows where that community starts and ends. Understood and defined boundaries are really important. Residency and tenure is an important thing. So we know that there is some sort of degree of transience or mobility of residents negatively associated with renting. So when people rent, there's a sense that the communities aren't quite so strong because those people don't have a sense of being part of those communities. And it's not often actually the renting per se, but it's often length and longevity of tenure. So, and often that's associated with renting. So the idea is that if you buy a home, you're more likely to live there longer, but that's not necessarily the thing that's really important. It's actually how long. So putting some sort of certainty into renting becomes quite an important thing, but certainly the longer people have been living in a community or the more people have been living there longer, strengthens community, strengthens resilience of those communities. And long-term renters had connection with neighbours. So one in this project after the earthquakes in Christchurch, one respondent talked about the churn in tenancy that is the issue. So that when people are moving around in tenancy because tenancy laws perhaps weren't strong, that became a problem. And after the earthquakes in Christchurch, there was a lot of population movement with people moving out of homes they couldn't live in, people moving out of homes to have repairs done, etc. A sense of home and place was also seen as important. So people talked about threshold spaces. So having verandas and porches where you could actually interact with neighbors so you could see people were seen as things that were important. People often talk negatively about subdivisions. So they talked about communities that had garages and high fences as being bad because you could actually, the situation where people could drive out of their house and not have to talk to anyone. Trees were seen as important, and I'll touch on vegetation and trees a bit later on, and lack of walkability and local amenity. So that's the idea that communities aren't good for walking, but also there weren't destinations to walk to rather. And I'll come on to this in a bit more detail later. But subdivisions, new subdivisions often were designed without these features. They were designed with fences, garages, not many trees, not good walkability, nowhere to go to, and people associated new subdivisions as not being good. And people also talked about their homes and gardens as being inextricably linked to place. So people said they described their home, they described their garden, and they found those really important. And again, fences came up. And one quote with fences, we've got a couple of quotes actually, but one was, it can take a long time to get to unlike the places with fences and garages. And the context this person gave this quote on was that walking, that they actually really liked that it would take a long place to get anywhere because they actually met their neighbors. So they'd walk down the street and they'd be stopping all the time. It took so long to get anywhere because they were stopping and talking to people. And they said, unlike those places where you've got garages and high fences where you don't see anybody. So they were talking about that in a very positive context. Another person said, I just wonder how lonely some people are behind their private spaces. So people were locked behind private spaces and they're lonely behind them. So again, this idea that the home or the fence or the garage is providing a barrier to you actually talking to your community and neighbors. Street morphology became really important, or it is important. So people talked about intimate streets where you can actually talk to people, and those included cul-de-sacs, so streets with no way of driving out. They talked about laneways, so these are roads around the back of houses sometimes, and they talked about back sections. Now the back sections only worked when there were more than two houses, so it wasn't just two houses on a back section, it would be 3 or 4, and so the back section creates that sense of community. And there were notable differences amongst street types in fostering social connection. So the different street types had different types of social relationship amongst on those streets. And again, people talk about, and related to some of the other points about garages and fences, they talk about shift to more private spaces, so that there was this shift away from communal space to private space, and that wasn't a good thing in terms of community. So one person's quote, "I really think the type of street is important. The cul-de-sac behind us has been great for us." So people like cul-de-sacs. And another person negatively said, "Our street is so wide, we don't know each other. We don't cross the street, maybe too much traffic. It's so wide, we just don't know our neighbors." Another one, and this builds on the point I've made already, that people get into their cars, they go to work, they come home, they press the little button for their garage door, and they go inside to their private spaces, never once turning around. So the idea is that you can literally leave your home, go to work, not see anybody, because your garage door opens, you drive off, there's no opportunity. Even opening a garage door provides some opportunity, but certainly walking and cycling, even just to get to bus stops, creates that ability to have those relationships with your neighbors. Back section's an interesting one, and some of the stuff's come out of Australia. Sorry, back lanes, the idea that you use the back lane as the place to socially interact, particularly where your front street is very busy. So if you live on a busy street, difficult to have those social interactions on the street, but actually increasingly people are saying that we've got these back lanes and we can use them and we can make them nice, and they become recreational areas. So those can be really important in some places. Walkability was one of the features that's already started cropping up, but the design of walkability, so people talked about safe and attractive and connected communities. One quote, "Because walking somewhere, you see people, and that's really important to us to see people and have that eye contact and being human together." So you see people, you interact with your neighbors when you walk, because you may walk past, your neighbors. So I know most of the people on my side of the street, and again, the side of the street's coming out, so we'll touch on that a bit later as well. We have Mickey the dog. I meet others with dogs. The bumping into people is important. I think it is what I like, and this is what I connect with. So the idea again that walkability becoming a really important feature. And one of my favorite quotes is, "If you have to get in your car, it's not local." So one person said this is their definition of local. If you can walk to something or bike to something, it's local. If you have to jump in your car, it doesn't count. And distance as well, so proximity to things. So the first point is about the nature of the environment, and we're starting to move into this idea of proximity. And then people talked about local shops, for instance, and they talked about, back we go, sorry. They talked about, it's funny how we don't have a name for them given how important they are to everyone. And I like places where people are at rather than places where people have to go to. So this is the importance of local places. And this leads on to this concept, this idea of how important is traffic and community. And some of you may have seen work by Donald Appleyard back in the late 1970s. He did this work in the United States. And he compared three types of streets. On the left, we've got the heavy traffic street, in the middle, the moderately trafficked street, and on the right, the light traffic streets. The levels are 16,000, 8,000, and 2,000 vehicles. And the lines indicate the relationships where people say they have friends, and then the little points indicate gathering spaces. And what you can see very clearly is that the lighter the traffic streets, so the less traffic, the more social interactions people have, both on their side of the street and across the street. On the heavy traffic street, nearly all the relationships are just on people the same side, and there's far less relationships than amongst the very light traffic streets. This hasn't been looked at much. It's been done a couple of times, I think once in the UK since, but then I had a student who decided she was really interested in and looked at this. And her heavy traffic street is 8,000 upwards, which if we just nip back, you can see is the moderate traffic street in Appleyard's work. And so in the very few interactions in the 8 to 14,000 vehicle a day street, one quote, "My street is a car thoroughfare. I lived here for 35 years. There's been a decline in people talking to neighbors and children playing." The moderate one, much lower. Most people get out and about. They talk on the street. It's family orientated and friendly. And we have great neighbors and live in a safe street. I enjoy talking with my neighbors. And both these two are quite similar because these equate, so the moderate and the light street equate to Appleyard's light street. And I guess the point, really clear point, is that the traffic you have, the more interaction you're going to have. People are more likely to socially interact with each other. So if we go on, and I don't want to touch on this much because I know you had Mark talking about this a week or so ago, about the Barcelona superblocks, where you basically restrict access to streets, you create slow spaces or spaces with less vehicles. And within that, you create these spaces. So you take out the through traffic and you create places of social interaction. And this is a couple of examples from Barcelona before and after. There was a cycle lane, but you've replaced the street with traffic on, with a street where kids are playing and making games and creating entertainment. And this sort of shared spaces, so this is what in essence they've done in the Barcelona superblocks, is they've created places for people. And these are some examples of other places. So they're not unique. Barcelona's not the only one. This is a place called Bathurst in the Netherlands. This is a newest development. And you can see from these images, there's lots of places of shared space, of places that create social interaction. And obviously these become more important when the density of housing is greater. So in these communities, there might be very small or no gardens, but you create places for people to have social interaction. So there's playgrounds, table tennis tables, etc., a bit of open green space as well. And this example's in Heidelberg, and again in another new development called Barnstadt, just outside Heidelberg, and there's big open plan areas, there's drafts and chessboards and table tennis tables. Again, in Rieselfeld in Freiburg, very clear signage saying that you're entering a street. You can still drive down some of these streets, but lots of signage very clearly indicating that this is the priority for this street is people. It's not vehicles. So beware, there will be people, and you create a very different sort of environment. And of course, this isn't new. These are some images from the UK back in the 50s, I think. And you can see that there are kids and adults playing on the street. And so these images are not new. In a way, it is a way of looking back and saying it's what we used to do in the past. And so it's a different way of thinking. And of course, it's visibly seen in things like called Midwife, where you can see lots of people biking, kids playing on the street, people walking, etc. So these sorts of things we're not talking about something dramatic and radical. We're actually talking about something we used to have and perhaps thinking maybe we could. What about in New Zealand? So I'm in New Zealand. This is one example of a study we did. This is actually the street I live on. It's a regular street, happens to have some nice trees, which is good. And there it is just normally. And then what happened is the council decided to repair a road, which meant completely closing the street to through traffic, so you could still drive in both directions. And the very first weekend, one of my neighbors, this guy in the black top here, he put a note around everyone saying, let's get the basketball nets out. We're going to have a big game of basketball on Sunday. So basketball took place. And then another weekend, I think we had cricket. There's my cricket picture. And so these things happened, and everybody assumed because of that I would have organized, and I knew it was nothing to do with me. It's this one neighbor said, look, let's do this. There was football another week. And we decided we'd look at this. So we did a study on it. The other thing that happened, actually, I want to mention this, is on this picture on the bottom right, is that got out and socialized as well. So I think one week the barbecue came out. You can't see it here, but the parents are sitting and chatting and having a glass of wine. So you've created, as well as a place for kids to have social interaction and play, you've also created a place for adults to get to know each other. And we know that those sorts of things are really good for mental health, mental well-being. They're really good when you have natural disasters, that you know your neighbors. Whole bunches of other reasons why this is a really good outcome. We decided to look at this, so we actually did a little piece of research. I didn't do any of the interviews because obviously I was conflicted, so my colleague Karen did them. And the conclusion we found on this was that residents value the community benefits restricting vehicle access to streets can afford, and these outweigh the disbenefits of any transport inconvenience this may come with. In other words, the people who live there, yes, it inconveniences them because they can't drive through their streets, but that's a price well worth paying for the benefit of having less traffic, knowing that your kids feel safe. On this particular street, it's not a particularly trafficked street. There's not lots of traffic, but the small amount of traffic there is enough to deter people from letting their kids play outside on their own. And so this very clearly showed that people want this, and they're quite happy restricting their access to get the benefits of less vehicles on the street. I want to tell you two quick stories. This is dilemma number one. This is my son. A few years ago, he looks nothing like that now. He's 6'5" and 15, so he's very different. This is him. And he, at one point, thought he'd like to try and play tennis and become the next Roger Federer. And the problem is that the tennis club here, if he had never played tennis before, he had to turn up for a lesson on 8 o'clock on a Saturday morning. If he looked like he'd played tennis, so he'd done 1 year, he could turn up at 9 o'clock for a group lesson. Now, I'm a parent, and I liked Saturday mornings, and I don't like getting up at 7:45 on a Saturday, but 8:45 is acceptable. So I thought, what I need to do I need to make it look like he's played tennis a bit, so that when he turns up and they say, yes, he's obviously played, he can go at 9 o'clock. And I thought, where can I practice tennis? Because he wasn't a member of the club then. And I looked outside and thought, well, here's a place that looks like a tennis court. It is across the street. So what I did here is I got his older sister and he practiced a bit of tennis, just enough. The street was almost the perfect width. It is tennis court size, tennis court width, not much traffic. They played tennis a few times. He turned up, practiced a bit. They said, you've obviously played 9 o'clock in the morning for you. So that was a win. But it just, to me, showed the value, potential value of a street space, which looks like a tennis court. Second example, he's grown up a bit now. I think he was about 12. And he changed his mind and he wanted to become LeBron James instead of Roger Federer. He was into basketball. And we didn't have a basketball court nearby, particularly. There's one at the school, but it's a bit of a walk. So I looked around, where could I put a basketball net if we got one? Where was a good bit of space? And we didn't have any in the garden. I didn't want to put down tarmac in the garden. But of course, I looked outside and there's a great big bit of tarmac in front of me. It's called the street. So I went on to Trade Me, which is a bit like eBay. And for $18, I bought this basketball net and I attached it to a post. And now he plays basketball here. Here he is playing with his mates. And if I were to look out my window at about 3:15, I could guarantee there'd be random kids. My son's now 15. He's now into mountain biking, doesn't play basketball particularly. But now other kids are out there playing. One of the neighbors is saying, let me help you repair it because it does need a bit of a repair at the moment. And so we've created a place for kids to play, for kids to get social interaction, to get to know each other. And we're using the street. And now I think enough cars know that there's a good chance kids will be there. And generally, the kids don't run into the street if they see a car coming. So kids aren't as stupid as sometimes I think people think they are. They don't generally want to get themselves hurt. The problem is, of course, there are naysayers to some of this stuff. This is an example that says, here we go, a hot topic about should kids be playing in our street? And here we go, and it says, oops, I'll leave that over there. It starts to really slow down traffic. So Josh is obviously angry about this. It starts to slow down traffic. I mean, you have to drive about 10 miles per hour in a fear a kid is going to dart out in front of you. It can sometimes add 30 to 90 seconds to your trip. Isn't that terrible? So this is the thing. It's generally people perceive streets as being places not for kids, and kids should not be seen on the street. But of course, historically, many of these streets were built way before cars. And so there's a bit of anger and a bit of angst we have to deal with. But generally, this is a really good outcome. Imagine that you have to slow down in case a kid might be on the street. What a great outcome that would be. The other thing we found in some of the projects we've done is the importance of green space and natural environment. So in this one, people talk about an intrinsic quality of life. People talk about green space having personal significance. People want to be alone. They meander, they're like walking the dog, meeting people. And trees was particularly seen as really important, and people noted where they were absent. So here's a couple of quotes from this one. Hagley Park is soul food for me, the natural place. It's my replenishing time. Hagley Park is a big park in the middle of Christchurch. My trees, I know them by name. And I walk by the river every day as I do my morning perambulation that cuts through a couple of parks that are a vital part of my life. So clearly we're getting not only physical places for physical exercise, but also places of mental, good for mental health. Very much people saying it's my time, it's good for my mental health as well as physical activity. These are two pictures. Again, this is my street just outside. So this is Fisher Ave, where I live on here. And then this is perpendicular to it. And I think most people, when they look at those pictures, say the picture on the right looks nicer, looks more welcoming. These literally are taken from the same spot, one looking one way, one the other. Admittedly, there's more traffic on one. But just the very presence of trees, I think most people would agree makes a difference. Here's another new, it looks like a new subdivision, just about 10 k's north of Christchurch. Actually, this is over 20 years old. This isn't a new subdivision, actually. It looks new, but it has no trees at all. And it looks barren, it looks unwelcoming. It doesn't look like the sort of place you'd want to sit out or talk or have some sort of social interaction compared to the picture down the bottom. So I think most people look at these sorts of images and think, I actually like trees. Trees enhance an environment. They look nice, and if they look nice, they're probably good for our mental health. And we know from research the importance of green space in terms of all sorts of outcomes. In this particular study, we were looking at associations between a number of neighborhood environmental statistics and obesity and related behaviors amongst adults in New Zealand. And we found that increased neighborhood deprivation and decreased access to green space was significantly associated with increased odds of being overweight or obese. So decreased access to green space associated with increased being overweight and obese. And that's controlled for socioeconomic status. So in other words, where there's green space, people are more physically active. And part of the reason is because they provide places they can have physical activity. They provide places people want to walk and cycle. We also know that there's a relationship between green space and mental health. So there's another study we did, and this one looked at access to green space. So the top two pictures, basically we put a buffer around a point of an individual. So we've got an individual's health status, we buffer it, we calculate the amount of green space. In this case, we calculate the amount of all green space. And on the right, we calculate the amount of usable green space. So some green space you can't access. You can see it, but you can't access it. It might be private land, it might be farmland. And the bottom one is where's the green space? So you calculate the distance. So in this case, it's to an unusable and a usable. And you use those four metrics to see whether there's a relationship between green space and mental health. And in this one, we found that decreased distance to green space and increased proportion of green space nearby were associated with decreased mental health problems, so mood and anxiety. In other words, if you've got green space nearby, or you live in places with lots of it, your mental health is better. And again, always controlled for socioeconomic status. So again, green space is seen to be good. The same applies to blue space. So generally, most people say I like being near the sea or the rivers. And often it's associated with wealth. So the wealthier places are near the sea, not always, but often. So we did a study here in Wellington, and we said, what about residential exposure to visible green space? So in other words, this was how much you can see. Now, technically, this is quite challenging because what you're saying is how much of something can an individual see? So technically, it's quite a challenging thing to do. You use a thing called viewshed analysis. And we did this in Wellington, and we found there was an association between increased views of blue space and decreased psychological distress. So there's the more blue space you can see, the better your mental health. And again, controlled for socioeconomic status. And the reason Wellington's quite interesting, it's quite hilly. So you can live quite close to the sea and not see it. And you can live quite a long way away from it and actually see it. So it really said, how much can you see? And does that make a difference? And it's not just a function of distance, it includes topography as well. Alcohol outlets, another one. We've done a bit of research. So we know, certainly in New Zealand and locally in Christchurch, I'm very aware that whenever a bottle shop wants to open a new store, the communities argue against it. And they say, we don't want this. And generally, they don't have a lot of evidence to back it up. They just think it is not a good thing. And the owners of the bottle stores have more resource, and all they have to do is prove that it doesn't make a difference. Unfortunately for them, it does make a difference. We've just had a paper produced last month that found that close proximity to alcohol outlets is associated with increased crime and hazardous drinking. So we've just finished this study. What's interesting is we had an earlier study from 2012 that found exactly the same thing. And by 2018, we were getting people coming to us saying, is this still up to date? And they would go to tribunals and court cases saying, this research shows violent crime is associated with more alcohol outlets. We don't want them. The alcohol outlet company said, oh, that's research is 8 years old. It's not. And so unfortunately for them, we've done it again and come out with the same outcome. So they now have no argument. Hopefully this is a sort of research that will inform policy, because the reality is presence of alcohol outlets is associated with all sorts of negative social outcomes. And again, controlled for socioeconomic status. So it's not just a function of socioeconomic status. Health services are also important. So if you live near health services, you're more likely to use them and have better outcomes. We did a study, another one a few years ago, looking at Healthline. So this is a place where you phone up and get your medical diagnosis done over the phone. And we found that people actually were still likely to go to the hospital if they lived close, even if they were told not to. And similarly, people who lived further away, if they were told to go to hospital, they'd still not go to hospital if they lived too far away. And we found 40 minutes drive from an ED is the threshold between good and poor accessibility. So if you live more than 40 minutes away, you're bad access, you're not likely to go, etc. If you live closer, it's generally okay. But there's a whole bunch of other research, that's just one example, that shows that having good health services nearby is an important thing in terms of the likelihood of you accessing health services when you need them. Just another thing that came out of one of the earlier studies I mentioned with Karen Banwell, the idea of gathering places. So this came out post-earthquake in Christchurch again. And we found that these were places of anticipated or planned interaction. So people would go there with the intent of meeting people, sometimes meeting people specifically, or sometimes going with the intention to meet someone they might not have been arranged to, but just knowing that people they know there. So these are places for purposeful social interaction, places like pubs, cafes, community houses, like swimming pools, parks, that sort of thing. And people talk about it's hard for people to engage with each other when you don't have a meeting place. So these are intentional meeting places. But the second group of places are bumping spaces. So these are places where people have social interaction, but they didn't intend to, but they happen accidentally. They're often local and linked to walkability, so they tend to be places nearby, but they're places of accidental, unplanned interaction. So they can just be street furniture. They can be primary schools where you go to pick your kid up from school, and you're not intending to meet, but you just do meet people. They can be parks, they can be community facilities, they can be local shops, they can be street furniture. So my basketball net again is an example where kids go there to play basketball, but they actually end up having unplanned social interactions as well. This one came out, the school was the only bumping place in one part of Christchurch. And this is the context of this is that after the earthquakes, the government decided that they would restructure schools. They thought this was a really good time to restructure schools. Just so you know, it was the worst possible time to do it. People were incredibly vulnerable and the government came in to make it worse. And they've actually subsequently apologized for the timing of what they did. Schools constantly popped up as bumping places, and people used the word bumping place. It wasn't something we invented. It was something the people we spoke to talked about. And yes, bumping into people, I think it is what I like and it's how I connect. So it's a really important thing. So these places to bump into people can also be planned as well. These are some examples from Canada. This is a cycleway in Canada, and again, you just put some park benches down, you create bumping spaces. This is the top right is a private residential development here, but you just put in some benches, some artwork, and you create places. And there's some people on the right meeting, I imagine, in an unplanned interaction. I didn't go and ask them, but just looking, that's my sense. But there's another example you can create about how you can create them. This is a friend of mine's house, a friend called Alan Jamison. That's his house here. When he bought it, the first thing he did is he took this fence. So you can see he took this fence down and he put a small park bench. He made a bench and put it in. People come and sit there. He goes out and he chats to them because he wants to chat to his neighbors. So he's created a bumping space and he's created social interaction as well. Community hubs became important, and I've already mentioned primary schools, but a lot of people talked about primary schools as places of community hubs, including having smaller community schools, because certainly in Christchurch, I think we're moving towards bigger schools, but less of them, which might be good to save money in terms of education, but it's not good for community. And again, this example of Phillipstown. Closing schools affects more than the school, it affects the whole community. And at the time, when pushed and asked about it, our Minister of Education said, no, it's just about schools and providing education, but actually increasingly we know it's way more than that. I just want to mention about one project about what's going on in our community. This is a project called Well Connected. It was funded by our Ministry of Health. And the aim of this project was to say, actually, how big a barrier is not knowing what's going on where you live, particularly amongst marginalized communities. So what actually is happening? Are there lots of activities? And if there are, how well do people know them? So one part of it is we took local information and we mapped it. So this are all the places you could have some sort of social interaction in Christchurch. And it's subdivided. You've got parks and reserves and community groups and cultural groups and a whole range of different social places of potential social interaction. And you can see there's a lot of them, a huge number of them. But one of the challenges we found in this project is that people didn't know where they were. So they didn't know what was going on locally. And so the aim of this project was to develop some resource that allowed people to identify what was going on locally so they could then interact. One of the things we found with this project is that in many cases, the people who needed to access the information probably weren't particularly computer literate necessarily. So one of the outcomes we got to is that actually it would be a third party who would actually help them. Now that could be the grandchild. The grandchild goes in with their their device, sits down with granny or grandpa and goes, look, here's this map, there's all this stuff happening near them. It could be the health professional. So it's a nice idea to say all you need to do is supply the information, and people can have those interactions. But actually, in many cases, those people don't have access to the technology or the means to access the technology. Again, we've got a little paper that came out when we started mapping at them, when we looked at how well are these facilities accessible. And our results demonstrated that overall, the majority of neighbourhoods in Christchurch benefit from a high level of accessibility to a whole bunch of services. But the noticeable exception is that the more deprived eastern suburbs have poorer accessibility, suggesting social inequity. Probably not surprising, but in other words, the people on the lowest income, the more marginalized people have the poorest access to some of these facilities. So what are sustainable, resilient, healthy communities? One of the neatest books that I've read about this is a book called Happy City by Charles Montgomery. It's probably maybe 5 or 6 years old now. It's called Happy City, Transforming Our Lives to Urban Design. It's written by a journalist or a writer, but he's based it on lots of academic information. And he comes up and says, look, the sort of outcomes you get clean air. When you create sustainable, resilient, healthy communities, the air tends to be cleaner. You tend to be more, your communities tend to be more resilient to things like pandemics, earthquakes, tsunamis, etc. You actually save on infrastructure costs. This is some data from the United States. This is the annual cost per household of suburban infrastructure, so nearly $3,500, compared to the annual cost of urban infrastructure, which is about $1,400. So it's actually much, much cheaper to have people living in urban areas than suburban areas. And we know that you get all these other benefits as well of people living closer together, sharing stuff, walking, cycling, etc. They also enhance health and well-being. Just one example I quite like. This is a relationship between active transport use in countries around the world and obesity prevalence. Obesity prevalence is the black squares. Active transport use is the little white circles. There's Australia proudly sitting at the wrong end of the graph. New Zealand actually sits next to Australia in there. So we have very high obesity rates and very low active transport rates compared to places like the Netherlands and Switzerland have very low obesity rates and very high active transport rates. So you know if you get people walking and cycling more, you improve their physical health. We also know that cities with physically active residents are also more productive, as well as being healthier. They actually, there are economic benefits in terms of productivity. And that we know that inner city living, which is what many of these communities are, they're more active, they're more socially engaged, they have lower rates of obesity, they're healthier, etc., etc. So inner city urban living is better in multiple ways if we can get it to work right. And also we know that when you trust your neighbors and you know them in your life, you have a better satisfaction. So you're happier when you can trust the people you live near, and you tend to trust the people you live near if you get to know them by getting out and being in your communities and meeting people. So this book, Happy Cities, came up with some really interesting health outcomes. So one outcome is that psychotic disorders, including schizophrenia, are most common in neighborhoods with the thinnest social networks. In other words, where you know more people, mental health seems to be better. The more connected we are with family and community, the less likely we are to experience colds, heart attacks, strokes, cancer, and depression. Connected people sleep better at night. They're more able to tackle adversity, live longer, and consistently report being happier. And low density sprawl puts residents at greater risk of arthritis, chronic lung disease, etc., etc. So a whole bunch of slightly unusual health outcomes associated with better designed urban places. So what is the future? It probably isn't going to be that. It certainly is shared mobility and scooters. It's going to be some sort of autonomous vehicle at some point. This is the one they were trialing in Christchurch. It may be autonomous flying taxis, and it might at some point be hyperloops. And one of the things, so these are some of the technologies coming. They all have impacts. And I think one of the keys to me about this is what sort of communities we're planning for. Do we let technology dictate what communities look like? Or do we say what we want? Do we set up a vision for what we want the future to look like and then try and get the technologies to help us? And I think it's the latter we should be doing. And I think you can get some sense from what some of the movies look like. So Fifth Element is one movie, and it's very much focused on these autonomous flying taxis like Cora. If you look at Total Recall, it's autonomous vehicles. Here's Arnie talking to Johnny Cab. This is the newer version of the movie. One thing about Johnny Cab is of course a computer, and Johnny Cab is there to reassure Arnie that there is somebody in control of the vehicle, even though it is just, and we know with autonomous vehicles, a lot of the work at the moment is going on the public acceptability work rather than the technology. There's obviously lots of work happening on the technology, but it's actually the public acceptability as well, and how people will respond to a vehicle with no one apparently in control. The one that scares me most is WALL-E, that if we let autonomous vehicles and flying taxis and door-to-door services take over, then we end up with WALL-E. And one of the other parts with WALL-E, I think it's interesting, is one is obviously eating and drinking. They've all got their devices. And if any of you watch the movie with these people, they don't actually talk to each other much. There's very little interaction. So to me, this is a nightmare scenario that we need to think to make sure we avoid. And the one that I think is quite an interesting one is the movie Black Panther. And this is one screenshot from Black Panther. And what you see is you see some sort of fast public transport at the top, but you actually have some sort of slower trackless tram or something at the bottom. But you actually have people walking. You actually have people walking and socially interacting. So to me, this is the idea of what vision. Do we want something that looks like this, or this, or this? Or actually, is this a better outcome? And I suggest this is possibly a better outcome, and therefore we will help us achieve that outcome rather than drive an outcome that may be undesirable. So to summarize, sustainable, resilient, healthy communities have a diversity of housing types, and I haven't touched on that much, but we don't tend to segregate different types of housing. The successful communities tend to have more of a mixture. They'll have low or no fences. Fences are not a good thing. I went to a community barbecue a couple of years ago in my neighborhood, and I introduced myself to this chap and said, where do you live? And he very proudly told me about he was in the house with the big fence. And I didn't know what to say because I didn't think his fence was very nice, because I know the research that says fences are not particularly good for community. They tend to have green and blue space, so they tend to have access to water, and are obviously not achievable everywhere. But in many cities, Christchurch is a really good example where we've actually covered over some waterways because it's easier and more efficient to manage. But we know that actually making them visible is a really good thing. You tend to have things nearby, so you have shops and schools, and ideally your job, but certainly shops and schools nearby. And some of you may have heard of this concept of either 10-minute or 20-minute communities where you can walk to or cycle to many of the local things. Good public transport tends to be a feature as well. So as well as being able to walk and cycle, you actually have good public transport for those longer journeys. And you tend to have lower volumes of traffic and or slower speed of traffic, so lower speeds. And it's something we're thinking about very significantly in this country at the moment, and they're putting in legislation to make it easier to reduce in communities that are designed for people to live in. And they tend to be physically activable. I'm not sure if it's a word, but the idea is that they are communities that it's easy, and they are designed to make walking and cycling easy. And I think with all of these, they're plannable. So I guess it is possible to plan all these things. It isn't just these don't happen by accidents. So final thoughts. Geography, I'm a geographer, so place and streetscape affect communities, and it affects the health and well-being of communities. The social infrastructure is important for enhancing community and improving well-being. So you can actually design bumping and gathering spaces, or you can at least allow communities to put them in. So my basketball hoop has not been permission. I have not had permission to do that. I've just done it, but no one stopped me doing it. So you become a society that makes it a permissive society that allows you to do these sorts of things. That we value the local community role of existing gathering spaces. So things like schools and churches, that they're not just places of education and worship, but they're actually places that are important to local communities. That we appreciate there are multiple co-benefits of investing in local community. So I give one example of, we don't just focus on solving climate change, because if we want to solve a climate change, one way is just to have lots of autonomous electric vehicles, but actually it may have negative knock-on consequences in other ways. So we've actually got to look at the multiple impacts of some policies. And we understand the importance of local access to amenity and social infrastructure. And again, go back to one of my favorite quotes: if you have to get in your car, it's not local. And finally, we can plan sustainable, resilient, healthy communities. They don't usually happen by accident. So we need to think this through. If we want our communities to be healthy, resilient, sustainable, we actually need to plan that. So that's me. This is one of my favorite quotes of all time from Fred Kent, an American planner, who says, if you plan cities for cars and traffic, you get cars and traffic. But if you plan for people and places, you get people and places. And to me, that I could have just put that one up and not talked to you for the last 45 minutes and would have been done, but there we go. So thank you very much. And I wonder if we have any questions.
We do have some questions, as it would turn out. So
Yeah,
for those of you who have submitted questions, I'll mention your name and I'll ask that you can please unmute your audio and ask your question to Simon. Please say your name and your organisation, or just, where you're dialing in from. And I'll hand over first to Molly Friedel.
Hi, can you guys hear me?
yeah.
Thank you. This is really informative, Simon. My question is, what exactly is the role government can play, specifically local, when it comes to creating these spaces? So is it grassroots, so like your case with the basketball court, or is it a build it and they will come kind of scenario for, what the perfect image that we're trying to create with resilient communities? Thank you.
I think it's a bit of both, actually. I mean, I think it's, in my case of my basketball hoop, it's government's not stopping them. So we have another example where kids, we've got the river just down the bottom of my street. Kids hang swings on it and then they swing in it in the summer and they jump into the river. And every now and then the council will come and take them down because they say they're not safe. So I think it's actually trying to encourage councils not to take things down. So my basketball hoop is definitely not safe, but it's not really dangerous, but it would not meet occupational health and safety rules, but it's not going to hurt anyone. So it's being permissive in that respect. I also think if you generate strong communities, people get mobilized to do some of this thing. So the stronger the community. So my neighbor is now saying to me, Simon, there's a couple of bolts fallen off, and I'm not handy at all. It's terribly put up. And my neighbor is saying, let's find something better and put it up. And that's because I know my neighbors, that we're having those conversations. And on the other side, one of the things our transport agency, which is aligned to the Ministry of Transport, has done recently, it has set up this fund. And I think it put about 10 million New Zealand dollars in it for a thing called Innovating Streets. So these were funds for projects that were to develop community-driven street projects. And the council are backing it. It's $10 million over 2 years. And that's what, about 200 meters of a state highway or something. So, I mean, it's a very small amount of money in the bigger scheme of things, but it's going to have huge impact, and they're now assessing the impact. So I think it's a mixture of providing some funds that help people do some of this stuff, and having local community that is allowed to do things. So I think it's a mixture of both. Molly.
Great, thank you. The next person we have is Neil Marsham.
Simon, great presentation, and I particularly like the correlations with health benefits, and I think that was great sort of to have science and data. My question, though, is you started off without defining community. Is community totally intuitive, or are there nuances that experts like you know about that I don't?
There are almost certainly nuances, and I'm not an expert on community. And I imagine people have written books and theses on community, and I think we can probably get bogged down in definition. I was actually in a meeting yesterday, Neil, where there was somebody from our Ministry of Social Development, and they were talking about how they're looking at some work to try and strengthen community during the pandemic at the moment. And this guy did not get into defining what community is. And I think it's kind of intentional. We can get very bogged down in defining it. And I think most of you probably got a sense of what I was talking about, and then didn't need to spend 20 minutes defining community. So I think, to me, it was it intentional? No, that I didn't define it, but I'm glad I didn't, because I think we'd have wasted lots of time and not had time for questions.
The next one's actually from me. So you're in a fairly unique position, being at the interface of research and policy. You get a good view of both sides, both worlds. In Victoria, we have an issue where our government, and both sides, it's a bipartisan issue, are very, very focused on building roads and more roads, and they often don't stack up in terms of the economic analyses. what can we do as researchers to better position our research to have more of a meaningful impact or influence on these decisions, these policy decisions?
Really good question. And one of the things I spent quite a bit, I've been doing this role for 2.5 years now in the ministry. And one of the things I've challenged myself to do is try and connect researchers with policy people. And I've done whole talks on it, but I'm going to give you the really short version. The problem is there's lots of barriers that stop us doing it. One is we're all incredibly busy, and the policy people are particularly busy. And so they literally have to write a policy and they need really quick access to evidence. So they don't have time and we don't have time, which is difficult because we need to create time. And we're doing some things in New Zealand to try and create that space. So we have an annual forum as an example, which is only one thing, but at least we're trying to get people talking to each other. The second one is, I think academics, I'm going to be really rude to some academics are terrible at talking to people in plain English. And we do research, I'm going to offend half the audience. I don't know how many people are there, how many I'm about to offend, but we do research that's detached from reality sometimes. And that's partly, unfortunately, because I know you have a research assessment exercise of some sort. I'm not familiar with the details, but the one in New Zealand rewards excellent papers in obscure journals. And excellent papers in obscure journals do not necessarily reach policy people. And sometimes they're methodological and they are doing something very, very clever, but not very useful without being rude. I'll give one example. I recently was asked to write something for The Conversation. Now, if some of you are involved with The Conversation, I think it's fantastic. And I wrote something for The Conversation, and it came out of a question that said, do motorways reduce congestion and reduce emissions? And the reason that question came up is because one of our parties in the election said they're going to build lots of new motorways. And I wrote this piece, and I was being really careful not to be political because I'm not allowed to in my job. And I wrote this piece, and 30,000 people read it, as against, normally I'm lucky if 5 people read an academic paper. So it is thinking through how we use our time. But one of the things I think as academics we need to do is reform the system that acknowledges whether we're good at our job. And generally it tells us we're good at our job if we write a really obscure paper in a really obscure journal, and it doesn't necessarily reward us for engaging. And I think it's changing. I know the UK it's changing, in this country it's changing, but it's probably not changing fast enough. So I think both sides have to make better efforts to talk to each other.
Yeah, we do have a bit of a policy impact thing in our ARC. It's been introduced not long after the UK one. But
yeah, good.
How you define policy impact is how long is a piece of string. But anyway,
absolutely.
All right, I'll pass on to the next one. Now, if you've asked multiple questions, please just ask the top question in the box. And we've only probably got time for 2 more. So we'll try and keep it quick. John Neve, and if you want to say where you're calling in from as well, please. We might move on to Jemima. Oh, he's here. All right, John, do you mind just, I'll just ask the question for him. It was really, how important is it for politicians to respect science, which I think,
it's obviously really important, and it's increasingly difficult, and the whole fake news stuff. And in the UK, I remember in the Brexit election, one of the politicians arguing against Brexit said, we don't trust experts. I'm lucky that I live in a country where our Prime Minister and the key ministers are very, very supportive of science. So our Chief Science Advisor to the Prime Minister and the Prime Minister have a fabulous relationship. So we're lucky. It is really important, but it doesn't often suit politicians, sadly. A good question.
Yeah. All right, I think this will be our final question. Katerina Velosevic. All right, I'll ask this one for Katerina as well. She wants to know about rural communities that are sort of stuck in the rut and towns that are closing down.
Yeah.
I'm not.
So in many ways, you might argue it's more important there, it's particularly if there's high unemployment and things. And some of these initiatives can be quite cheap to do. So I think Detroit in America has done some really interesting things with community to try and enhance community, and that's a big version. It's not a small community, but it's a big community that's really struggled. So absolutely, it's probably more important, but I think there are cheap ways of doing it, and there are lots of really interesting examples in terms of placemaking. I can see a couple of others. Can I really quickly answer them?
Yeah, go for it.
There's one about alcohol outlets and gambling. Yes, it does apply. We did a project a few years ago on gambling. Absolutely, it applies. Potential for nature strips on verges, yes. One of the things you have to be careful of, and I spoke to one of the guys at our council, is that sometimes verges can have nasty things on that have been swept off the roads, or they've previously been roads. So you have to be careful and get the soil tested about verges. So there's two of them I can quickly see. Another one about boys and girls. Somebody asked this one before, is it? Yes, boys and girls playing basketball. There were girls playing, not as many, more boys. And I think you're right, you need to create different sorts of places. One quick example, we're building benches for our community out of pallets, and a girl came along and said, I don't want a bench, I want a mud kitchen. So we're making a mud kitchen to go by the little pond for her. So you just have to create the right things for the right kids, absolutely.
That's brilliant. Well, thank you so much, Simon. It was such an inspiring and interesting presentation. I find so many of those things absolutely fascinating, and it's amazing to see things that you experience in real day life actually, put out there as an academic sort of term, and you're like, actually, yes, my goodness, I hadn't thought of that. So I absolutely love it, and I really, really hope it's been inspiring for everyone attending. And we've got a lot of work to do in our communities, I think, particularly in the COVID recovery. As Mark Neuenhauser said, we only get this chance once to spend this stimulus money, and hopefully we all are inspired to push it in this community-minded direction. Thank you so much, Simon. For the rest of you, we check out the Climate website. We have more seminars coming up. A range of topics, always some interesting ones there. So please have a look at those and sign up. And once again, thanks so much, Mark. And I hope you can go and enjoy that nice day in Christchurch. And we'll see you later.
Thanks very much.
Bye.